So before we begin, my company literally makes money from foreign investors moving to Canada and buying businesses. So I have every financial incentive to tell you how great Canada is to live here. But I no longer believe that is the case. In fact, I'm sad to say something I never thought that I would ever say. I'm considering leaving Canada myself. I think it's actually gotten that bad. Why is that? So let's start with the easy one that everyone always talks about, the weather. Now, this is not a random picture that I chose of the most extreme weather in Canada. This is literally me at my house shoveling a 6-foot-high mountain of snow. Canadian snow and wind, it creates massive drifts that can completely cover your car. Ice storms are a thing. This was an ice storm we had back in 2017. My wife walking down my neighbor's driveway. The trees all bent over from the weight. Many big ones snapped and broken. And the power was out here for a complete 9 days. Now, if you have romantic notions of softly falling snow outside, the fireplace crackling, that's not how it works in most of Canada. Weather in the vast majority of the country is cold, it's icy, and it's dreary more than half of the year. And if you think, no problem, I'm just going to hire someone to shovel the snow or to do my driveway, think about that again, because finding workers in Canada to do anything is often impossible. So you end up having to do most things yourself. And that includes pest control, plumbing, electrical, and yes, snow removal. Next up, Canada is a very liberal country. And if you're coming from a religious or a conservative background, you're likely going to find it quite difficult to adjust. Now, liberalism, it was a great strength in Canada for many, many years, but in its extreme form, it can unfortunately create a lot of division. Now, recently, this Canadian teacher who was a biological male identifying as a female, decided to wear giant prosthetic breasts and short shorts to teach her shop class in school. Now, the school board actually supported this, as they say, we do not discriminate against anyone. So the kids who are currently protesting have to suffer this person living out a fetish because Canada and the school boards are so liberal, everything and anything is accepted. In many schools, it's become uncool to be straight, and some parents are concerned that children are being taught at too young an age about sex and transgender issues. Now, the same thing that you hear about in the USA happening, it's happening here, even to perhaps a greater extent. Because the media here is mostly left-leaning, you don't hear anything about these issues. Now, again, if you're coming from a conservative country where you have conservative or religious values, Canada is probably going to feel overly liberal and might be frustrating for you at times. Now, in addition to that, many young men that I've spoken to who've immigrated to Canada into the major cities suggested that many of the single women, these guys had been all around the world, they see this single women in Toronto, Vancouver, they seemed superficial and angry, and they actually ended up moving back home because of the unfriendliness of Canadians. Now, this was the exact opposite 20 years ago. Canada's known as a very friendly country. Doesn't seem that that's anymore the case. Next up, cost of living. It's shocking how little people know about the cost of living before they come here. You really need to think about this. Everything in Canada, I mean everything, is outrageously expensive. And the wages are substantially lower than the USA in the vast majority of cases. And we'll look at that in a moment. So as far as housing goes, if you move out to the West Coast, okay, over in BC, this is a pretty average house in Vancouver, not even renovated. The listing, in fact, suggests you probably want to tear this house down and build another house. The cost for this, $2.3 million. So with a $300,000 down payment, your payments each month would be around $13,000. Now, the east coast of Canada, over on the other side of the country, it's a little bit cheaper, but it's no longer as cheap as it once was. In fact, housing prices have tripled in some areas. For groceries, I pay $10 for one small loaf of gluten-free bread. I pay $11 for a small 3-pound bag of apples, and free-range eggs are going to set you back $7.50 a dozen. Owning a cell phone is ridiculous in Canada, and a recent report showed Canada, for a 4G cell phone plan with at least 100 gigabytes of mobile data per month, was the highest in the world at $144 for that pretty basic service. Now in Israel, that same service costs $10. Canada, the highest prices for cell phone service in the world. Now I have associates whose family phone bills, their children and wife, they pay thousands of dollars per month just for phone bills. It's absolutely ludicrous. Short flights, if you want to fly anywhere in Canada, hundreds of dollars. It's absolutely ridiculous. Shipping anything, even a small package, you want to send someone a gift or a book, it's an absolute fortune. And if you want to start a business that actually ships physical goods, you need to look at this very closely because it can break your business, the ridiculous cost of shipping here in Canada. So you might extrapolate from that, so everyone must be rich in Canada, right, to afford these crazy prices. Absolutely not. The pay here, in most cases, much lower than the USA. Many Canadians have left Canada for the US to make more money, and there's hundreds of comments online and in forums from immigrants who can't believe how low the pay is in Canada, and they wish they had known these things before they had moved. Here's a comment. I'm from Australia, currently going through my permanent residency application. I'm having serious second thoughts about making Canada my new home. The cost of living compared to wages and opportunities is atrocious. I'm an educated professional earning less here in a full-time job than I did at 17 years old back home. He meant Australia, in a part-time job. That doesn't make sense. How people can support a family on these wages is nothing short of a miracle. Having lived in this country for a few years makes me realize just how good Australians have it. Maybe I'll move back home. I thought this would be different. Now, this sentiment is mirrored throughout forums all across the internet. The pay is quite low compared to cost of living, and many Canadians and new immigrants are having to work 2 to 3 jobs just to make ends meet. Now, the government cheerfully takes your taxes and they send billions of dollars to other countries, while 1 in 7, or about 4.9 million people in Canada, are living in poverty. Precarious employment, that's increased by nearly 50% over the past 2 decades. And over the past 25 years, Canada's population's increased by 30%, yet annual national investment in housing has decreased by 46%. And speaking of taxes, taxes in Canada are beyond ridiculous. The total tax bill of the average Canadian family has increased by 1,624% since 1961. The argument always was, well, our health care and our roads are so good, it's absolutely worth it. But they no longer are. Where I live, there is a 3-year-long waiting list to see a family doctor. 3 years. Referral waiting times from general practitioner to specialist ranges from 20 weeks to over 1 year, depending where you live. If you visit a hospital emergency room in Quebec, there is a 50% chance you're going to wait at least 4 hours. There are stories online of people waiting 10 plus hours to see an emergency doctor. Some hospitals literally have 0 emergency doctors on staff, so you better hope you don't have an emergency while in Canada. Dental work is a fortune. It is not covered at all. My wife recently had some work done on her teeth. The final bill is going to end up being $60,000. Now, I looked up some places elsewhere in the world. That same procedure around the world would have been around $5,000 to $7,000. Now, as far as the roads, they're terrible in many places. The road I live on, they come by every year. They patch a few really bad potholes. They never repave. The current Liberal government, they take your money, but refuse to even tell Canadian citizens where their money is going. Is that frustrating? Absolutely it is. Do most Canadians care? No, they do not. Why is that? The solution in most Canadians' minds for any problem that you might bring up to them, if you don't like Canada, then leave. Canadians never want to try and fix anything or discuss anything. They have blinders on. They just don't care. Their response to any concern that you bring up to them, if you don't like Canada, there is the door. I wish they would change the taxes. If you don't like the taxes, then leave. The RCMP nailed my to a chair. If you don't like Canada, then leave. No Canadian ever wants to discuss these problems. They prefer to keep the blinders on and tell you how awesome Canada is while they're working a 70-hour work week just to feed their family. Now, most Canadians only read the Canadian newspapers, which receive billions of dollars in subsidies from the government, and they very rarely report any negative stories. So Canadians are mostly oblivious. So I don't want to be a drama queen, but my perception right now of Canada is that it has become a tyrannical dictatorship, and most Canadians just don't know it yet. Virtually every major media company in Canada, as I said, receives millions from the government. In fact, the CBC alone, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, gets over $1 billion a year of taxpayer money. Now, because of this, virtually every story in the Canadian media is a glowing review of the government and how great Canada is, and anything that goes against the government or the narrative is branded as racist or terrorist, even if it has nothing to do with racism. Governments and people around the world who are not in this Canadian bubble know this.
Kanada, nekada simbol modernog svijeta, je pod vodstvom vaše kvazi-liberalne čizme proteklih mjeseci postala simbol kršenja temeljnih ljudskih prava i građanskih sloboda. Za vas su to možda liberalne metode. Međutim, za mnoge građane svijeta to je diktatura najgore vrste.
A prime minister who openly admires the Chinese basic dictatorship, who tramples on fundamental rights by persecuting and criminalizing his own citizens as terrorists just because they dared to stand up to his perverted concept of democracy, should not be allowed to speak in this house at all. Mr. Trudeau, you are a disgrace for any democracy. Please spare us your presence. Thank you.
Our Prime Minister recently invoked the Emergency Act on peaceful protesters. The government seized their bank accounts, and they seized the bank accounts of anyone who donated and supported to the cause. Now imagine you support a cause that you believe in, and the government seizes your bank account. This is Canada today, and whether you are against or whether you support the cause really should not matter. It should be immaterial, because tomorrow's cause that the government shuts down and takes those people's money, that could be something that you believe in. Now, eventually, after global outrage, the government finally caved and allowed for some money to be unfrozen. Now, sadly, most Canadians, they didn't care, because it wasn't their protest. Government newspapers pushed propaganda out to the Canadian people, and unless you read the news from around the world or watched live events as they were happening on places like YouTube, you were told this was a small group of anti-vax, violent extremists, when in fact even Trudeau himself acknowledged and thanked over 90% of the truckers who were already vaccinated. It was never just about the vaccines for most protesters, but the majority of Canadians will never know what actually happened. Government propaganda is a big problem in Canada. Recently, the #1 Twitter hashtag was Trudeau must go. Thousands of Canadians branded as racist or undesirable by Trudeau just for speaking out against him for creating this division in our country. Now, this is the saddest part of everything for me. I can handle $10 bread, but Canada used to be so friendly, used to be so welcoming to everyone. They would listen to any problem that anyone have. And over the past few years, that has really changed for the worse. The awesome Canada that you've heard about, that you might think, wow, I really want to go there, it doesn't exist anymore. The current Liberal administration has been plagued by scandals, including the SNC-Lavalin affair, the We Charity Group, and if corporate transparency is important to you, you may not want to move to Canada. Canada is basically the worst country in the world for corporate whistleblowers, which is about to change before Trudeau took power. Tom Devine, legal director for the Government Accountability Project, stated, "We were rolling towards an upgrade of Canada's whistleblower, a real comprehensive makeover." But he, meaning Trudeau, was elected. Everyone was optimistic. He killed it. And then a few years later, I could understand why, because he was facing scandals of his own. Citizens should never be scared to voice their opinion, and I realized as I was making this video, I'm scared of the government, right? You won't hear about it on the mainstream media, but Trudeau's personal bodyguards have beaten up reporters. David Menzies, he was assaulted by Trudeau's henchmen, physically assaulted, face smashed against the wall. Complete video of this is available online as it happened, but the majority of Canadians have absolutely no idea. You would think that a member of the press being beaten by the leader of your country's bodyguards is going to be front page, but most Canadians will never even hear of this. Authors of books that were critical of the current Trudeau government have been brought in for questioning by police. Canada is becoming more and more like a communist country, in my opinion. If you are attracted to moving to Canada because it's a free country with friendly government and people, that is not always the case, in my opinion. If you're an immigrant who's coming here with a professional background, your home country experience in most cases does not count at all. And there's also very high competition in the labor market. Canada will not acknowledge most degrees from other countries. So you're going to see many dentists, doctors, engineers doing minimum wage jobs as they basically have to start all over from scratch here in Canada. Now, at the same time, people are dying because there's no available doctors. So if government stupidity makes you angry, you probably want to reconsider moving to Canada. So between taxes, lack of services, poor healthcare, high cost of living, freezing 6 months out of every year in today's divisive politics, I would not blame anyone for leaving and certainly wouldn't fault anyone for reconsidering moving to Canada. Thanks for watching, and if you don't like the channel, just leave.